In the iron winter of 1206, beside the frozen bends of the Onon, the tribes gathered and lifted Temüjin upon their shoulders, naming him Genghis Khan. The wind cut like glass across the steppe, and the horses steamed in the blue morning. But the new Khan's eyes were warm with calculation. Few guessed then that his sharpest blade would not be the composite bow or the storm of hooves, but the mind itself, fear as strategy, rumor as cavalry, perception as a siege engine. Sun Tzu had written of a triumph that breaks an enemy's will without meeting his sword. Genghis Khan would make that principle ride. He began by turning a battlefield inward, uniting the steppe not by treaty, but by choice forced upon men's imaginations. Rivals were not merely defeated. They were collapsed, their names folded into silence. Even Jamuka, blood brother, mirror, rival, became a lesson more than a man. A whisper passed between yurts on cold nights. Resist the Khan and your memory dissolves. Obey and your sons might live to eat meat in spring. When the tribes finally bent, it was not only to his strength, but to the story he had taught them to believe. By 1219, the rumor of his coming rode before him like a black banner. Along the Silk Road, the caravan spread tales of a people who never slept, of horsemen who turned rivers against cities and made the sky rain fire. Refugees, deliberately spared and harried onward, carried those stories ahead of the army so that walls trembled before the first hoofprint. At Bukhara, the defenders weighed courage against the monstrous shadow and found their hands too heavy to lift. Genghis Khan entered the great mosque and spoke like a sentence. I am the punishment of God. If you had not sinned greatly, he would not have sent me. The words were not theology. They were design. Behind the dust and banners moved a second empire, the Yam, a web of posts and relays strung across a continent, couriers changing mounts every few miles, messages leaping like sparks. Merchants played at commerce and carried intelligence. Monks counted beads and counted arsenals. An astrologer read a city's future while mapping its gates. The network inflated armies to phantoms, turning 100,000 riders into 1,000,000 in the minds of their enemies. Men surrendered to arithmetic they could not verify. Terror took form. At Urgench, pyramids of skulls rose pale as moons in the sun. At Nishapur, where the Khan's son-in-law died beneath an arrow, vengeance became policy. Even the dogs fell silent and did not bark again. The Mongols left marks the way a cart leaves ruts, 3 arrows planted in earth, attack imminent. A broken arrow, mercy granted. Scouts rode ahead with reins painted red, and whole garrisons saw blood where there was only lacquer and fled. To ally with the Khan was to live, for a season. The Tanguts discovered that season's end. So did the Jin. Today's friend became tomorrow's proof. Deception refined itself into art. Subutai, cold as iron, let the princes of Rus chase him for 9 days along the Khalkha, until their formation frayed like rotted rope. Then he turned. At Liegnitz, knights galloped into a mouth that closed behind them, the field swallowing banners like a tide. They flee to conquer, a chronicler wrote, and men learned too slowly that the retreat was a net. When the Khan's grandson fell at Bamiyan, wrath made a theology of ruin. The city became a grave with a name, the city of sorrow. People spoke of poisoned ground and silent birds. Whether the legends lied hardly mattered. In the economies of fear, belief buys the same obedience as truth. By the time Genghis died, the map of his empire ran from one sea to another, and the echo of his hooves reached places his horses never did. Rule, for him, was a theater of law. The Yassa did not merely command, it warned. To pollute a running stream invited death. To abandon a comrade invited death. To steal, to lie in certain ways, to defy the machinery of the horde, death. Punishment was performance, deserters torn as if by the hands of an invisible step. Traitors left honeyed in the sun until insects wrote their sentences upon the face. At Bukhara, merchants who had weighed profit above obedience received molten silver in eyes and ears. In Samarkand, the metal was gold, not mercy. The lesson glittered. The streets remembered. Cities, too, were treated with a method that felt like mathematics. First the gates, starved, poisoned, convinced. Then the people, divided, sorted, used, erased. Artisans were spared not for compassion but function. A weaver is a captured loom, a mason a walking quarry. At Merv, the butcher's tally ran into hundreds of thousands. A sliver of survivors was left to carry the memory outward, like a brand upon the world. In Herat, rebellion earned a slow death. Fields salted to silence, canals broken, libraries burned until knowledge itself smoked. They made the learned eat their own words, a witness wrote, meaning it almost literally, but even cruelty was ordered. Before the great executions, the condemned bowed 9 times toward the north. Shamans rattled bone and sang the dead into a service that did not end. Platforms were built high so that fear would have the longest possible sightline. Special units in black leather and red-smeared faces traveled with the host, experts in endings. The rumor of their arrival was often enough. The Mongols rule by fear what they could never rule by love, wrote one geographer, and the sentence outlived him, intact. Hierarchy posed a different problem, and the Khan solved it with humiliation engineered like a siege. Aristocrats were made to wear their silks backward while they mucked stables. Imperial seals were melted into bits for horses. Ceremonial swords turned into spits for meat. Kings crawled and touched their foreheads to the dust before the Khan's horse, while their courtiers spat on them by order. Nobles were separated like a herd, 1/3 executed, 1/3 taken away as hostages, 1/3 left in office under a watchful chokehold. Forced marriages bound conquered blood to Mongol sinew. Sons of princes learned to speak with a steppe accent and returned to rule in their former homes with loyalties rewired. It was not enough to kill a crown. One had to unteach the idea of it. The sieges themselves were symphonies of calculation. At Zhongdu, the city lay inside a ring of riders, while wells were turned to poison with carrion. Famine did the fighting no ladder could finish. When the gates fell, the balance of mercy broke with them. At Urgench, engineers turned a river into a weapon and the streets into channels. Chinese counterweight trebuchets hurled fire in parabolas that wrote the same answer each time. From the walls, defenders watched the elements change sides. Water and flame conscripted into the horde. Elsewhere, the Mongols studied sound and terror as if they were sciences. Whistling arrows with hollow bones screamed like blown flutes across the sky, and men broke before wood broke. Bodies became missiles. Children, sometimes, were slung back over walls alive but ruined, because despair is quicker than stone. The administrators tallied death with a clerk's patience. Ears cut to count, notches tied with colored thread to distinguish soldier from civilian. Numbers, as the Khan said, speak louder than rumors. He understood that bureaucracy is a kind of drumbeat. Destruction extended to the earth itself. Where irrigation had made orchards, iron tools unmade them. Wells were not only fouled but sealed with metal. Fields were not only burned but salted into decades of silence. Trade routes, once cleared of opposition, were guarded so fiercely that merchants crossed continents in safety. The peace that followed the storm bore his name, the Pax Mongolica, a paradox accepted because caravans prefer certainty to justice. The whip brings peace, people said, and peace bought with blood is still peace. His methods were contagious ideas. Timur learned them and added mirrors. Others adapted the arithmetic to their own generations. Ottoman theorists wrote that fear is the blade sharper than steel. In Hungary, whole regions fled at the rumor of hooves. In Poland, towns lit themselves like offerings rather than face the riders. For years after, mothers quieted children with a whisper, "The Mongols are coming," and the cradle obeyed what the memory commanded. Genghis Khan's punishments were not merely savage but symbolic. A cauldron could be punishment and omen both. After rebels were boiled alive near Khanbalik, people saw cooking pots as prophecy. Collective guilt became policy. One family's weapon meant a neighborhood's grave. In Bamiyan, an entire village was buried alive for concealing fugitives, and the earth, they said, moved for days as if it were breathing its last. The soldiers poured water to tamp the struggling ground. The valley learned its new name, a chorus of screams, then wind. Ceremony framed even the blood of kin. A brother humiliated, a son stripped of command, law before lineage, theater before family. Better no family than a disloyal one, the proverb went, and the proverb wore armor. When Tangut rulers were taken at the end, the executions unfolded in measured ranks, the lowest dying first, the highest last, as if death itself were a staircase. The chief shaman danced and told the air that the dead had duties still. Meanwhile, the siege train improved like a school. The 100 mines, the engineers drawn from captured talent, built rams that breathed smoke and struck like thunder. Trebuchets learned new weights and new distances. Fire grew teeth when mixed with saltpeter, sulfur, and fat. Dragons of flame arced over Kaifeng and turned night into a lie. The sound of the engines alone, metal roaring, ropes screaming, the world splintering, knocked courage loose from men's chests. Nearby cities surrendered to a rumor of a machine they had never seen. Their strategy bled into climate and time. Break the canals and the orchards die. Break the orchards and the wind lifts the soil. Lift the soil and the sun finishes the conquest. A century later, barren belts still marked the path of the horde like scars. Archaeologists would read those scars the way a physician reads a wound. The patient is the earth, the diagnosis a memory. In the cities that tried to hold, the Mongols rearranged fear like a sculptor rearranges clay. Skull pyramids rose with geometry. Children here, women there, soldiers in rings. Letters arrived in other towns. Descriptions of deaths catalogued with the care of archivists, tokens enclosed, an ear, a toy, a thread stiff with blood. Panic does not require proof, only a pattern. The pattern, once established, enforced itself. And yet, in that brutal symmetry, there were moments when a different face showed. The road stations hummed. A merchant crossed from one sea to the other, guarded by men who had torn down half the world to make such travel safe. Craftsmen kidnapped from broken gates built new capitals where markets buzzed beneath banners. Even as knowledge burned in some places, it was copied in others, carried saddlebag to saddlebag, language to language, under a peace sustained by dread. The Khan understood that to rule men, you must rule their stories, who they have been, who they are allowed to be tomorrow. He unmade kings and remade them as clerks. He severed bloodlines and stitched them back into his own garments. He allowed a city to live not out of mercy, but to make neighboring cities rehearse their surrender early. He left platforms standing after an execution so that the wood itself told time, each board remembering another weight. In the end, he conquered a geography of minds. From the Pacific's edge to the fields that smell of Danube hay, from the hushed snow north of Karakoram to the deserts that sing when wind crosses them, his name traveled as if it were a weather system. They said it quietly in mosques and shouted it in markets. It frightened children into sleep and woke princes in sweat. The horses that carried it are long gone. The dust they kicked up has settled into history. But the tactics, the arithmetic of fear, the choreography of humiliation, the bureaucracy of death, still move like bones beneath the skin of empires. They came, the chroniclers wrote, and they saw and burned and slew and plundered, and then they departed. But the world they left behind did not become what it had been. It learned that you can break a city by breaking its courage, that you can bend a people by bending their past, that peace can be hammered from terror and still shine enough to blind. If there is a lesson, it is not gentle. A mind is a battlefield, and Genghis Khan mapped it better than most. He drew his borders on fear, and for a long time no one dared to erase them.